Be the one, be the one. Kamen Rider movies suck. Okay, obviously not all of them. It's just odd how strangely uninteresting and terrible they are when the shows they're based on are incredibly creative and fun and engaging. Obviously, there's a ton of Kamen Rider movies, and I haven't watched every single one of them, so I'm not going to go through and rate each one. There's also going to be a lot of spoilers for Kamen Rider movies in this video, so be aware. Now, Kamen Rider movies weren't always necessarily bad. A lot of the early 2000s Kamen Rider movies essentially served as alternate endings to the show. Primarily Ryuki, Faiz, and Blade. I actually prefer this format to pretty much everything we've gotten after that because it makes sense to have all these new characters come in and new riders come in and the status quo to be shaken up in the movie when it serves as the end for a currently airing series. Now all the Kamen Rider summer movies specifically all just kind of seem to be random side stories that vaguely take place at the end of the show sometimes, but aren't ever really mentioned. The only time I really thought that worked was in Double's movie. In Double's universe, the movie's pretty hard codified into the lore, and the general plot makes sense as to why, everybody's attention all of a sudden is paid onto these new villains and stuff like that, rather than the main plot going on. Double's movie is also good because it really expanded, but also had the self-contained arc that built off of the show in terms of the Cyclone Dopant potentially being Philip's mother. Philip's arc in the series being he's lost all his memories and he has all this knowledge, but he can't remember who his family is. So I thought that arc in the movie really did add a little bit to his character. It also doesn't help that these movies generally don't have very memorable villains. I was just sitting here getting ready to record, I was sitting and thinking about, past Kamen Rider movies and what memorable villains. There were some obvious ones that came up like Eternal, and G4, and Ryuga and stuff, but I can't remember most of these villains. Who remembers the villain of the Summer O's movie? My assumption is that, at least for the summer movies, it's kind of hard to create an interesting or compelling villain in the span of an hour. I mean, the early Heisei movies were an hour, but they really did try to make memorable villains, and oftentimes they were based on characters from the show, so there was less build-up that they needed to do in order to make you believe in the threateningness of the villain. In the Faiz movie, we see Kiba become the villain, and we empathize with Kiba because we see him so much in the show, and it makes it kind of tragic when he does go up against Takumi at the end. We saw the relationships that he had with his friends, and how he lost all that during the movie, and how it drove him crazy. Compare that to something like the X-Aid movie, where, you see the main character of that, the ninja guy, I forget his name off the top of my head. You see him really struggle and stuff with his daughter, having this disease and stuff, and it sucks and it's relatable, but, we don't know anything about him aside from this movie. He's not in the show at all, and if he is, I'm sure it's like a one-time cameo, and we never see him again after this movie. I'm not saying that you can't have a character that's exclusive to a movie and can be good, but it's just when you have an action movie with, a bunch of toys you gotta sell and all this stuff going on, it's just easier if you set that all up in the main show in the first place, so that way they can hit the ground running when the movie happens. I think the only Rider series since Decade that has really fixed sort of the disconnection between the summer movie and the show is ZO. But ZO has a bunch of time travel stuff in it and resetting realities and stuff, so it's not really fair. Now the summer movies are meh to okay, but I think the Movie Wars movies started out interesting, but once they started moving to sort of a single narrative format, became less and less interesting. The first Movie War film, I think, was Decade and Double. I really think that this first film really succinctly shows the three-part Movie War formula to a T. First you have, the currently airing Kamen Rider, and usually that'll be some sort of interesting side story, or maybe important backstory. Movie War 2010 containing possibly the best one of these segments being Begins Night. You see Kamen Rider Skull and his demise, and then ultimately Double's origin story. The next story being an epilogue for the previously airing Kamen Rider. A lot of these segments were hit or miss. Sometimes it depended on how good the original show was or not, and some of them felt kind of extraneous. With Decades ending being about as good of a resolution for that show is, depending on if you think it's good or bad. And then you had the last half hour, which the two riders go and beat up some big CGI monster. Of course, with the cameo by the currently airing Rider's next power-up, these parts tended to suck. But it was only the back third of the movie instead of the whole movie. The last one I watched that had distinct segments to it was Gaiman Drives. I watched X-Aid and Ghost's movie, and the single continuous narrative really bothered me. My assumption is that making it a single continuous narrative would make things feel less disparate and make the narrative feel stronger. But it's taking the same elements from before, but it's just putting it into a completely linear format. This is more specific to this movie in particular, but it didn't feel like they really developed the personalities of any of the villains because there were so many of them, and they all had just one cardboard flat character trait. I mean, we get to see, a little bit of after stuff from Ghost at the beginning and the end of the movie, but then we also have, Emu's surgery, that sort of side story going on in the film, and then ultimately the big bad guy tying into Emu's side story, and of course being a giant CGI Pac-Man. You have this emotional story about Emu and the secret surgery causing a lot of the problems and stuff happening in the show, and this conflict with the person who did it to him. And you're getting towards the end where they're fighting each other, and then all of a sudden, Mighty Brothers Double X just shows up. I mean, it made sense for the super form to have a cameo in the previous format. It was just the big, okay, here's the CGI monster fight now. But watching X-Aid create and then lose Mighty Brothers Double X in this final battle, it just feels like it killed all the momentum. And watching the trailer for the 01 and ZO crossover movie, it didn't feel like any of that's changed. And let's talk about the spring movies. I know Toei doesn't always necessarily make a spring movie. Sometimes you'll get a Superhero Taisen. Sometimes you'll get, sort of a different Kamen Rider related movie. Sometimes you'll get stuff like Rider Time, which take up that, sort of slot despite not being an actual film. I think these have the worst batting average out of all the Kamen Rider movies. Superhero Taisen, not great. Superhero Taisen Z was not good either. Kamen Rider Taisen was like a mountain of shit that had little nuggets of gold. Best one out of these, I think, is probably the Kamen Rider 1 movie. I mean, everybody makes memes about Buff Ichigo, but, I thought the interaction between Ghost's cast and, Hongo was pretty great. Honestly, I think that Toei should just use the resources that it would have put into a movie and do more stuff like Rider Times. Mini-series that are interesting and short, but the fact that all these movies aren't great doesn't really matter because the main medium of Kamen Rider is television. You have much more time to create interesting stories and interesting villains. But it would be nice if the movies didn't suck. Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you tomorrow.